Thank you, Xander. That was quite an impressive talk, especially since you're just beginning. So now I want to welcome Xander, who is joining us virtually to ask some questions. Xander?
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
I am so impressed about how much you've already learned when you say you're just starting. It will be amazing what you can do once you begin to actually dive into this and do some real research. But already, there was tons of stuff that was new to me. One of the things that I was really curious is, did you find anyone else asking this question? I'm like, it seems now in retrospect almost an obvious question to ask, but has there been very much other research like this, or anyone else going around asking this question?
It's a really good question. I mean, the reason I started on this project was really because we needed to solve this in a way for ourselves. We were the first use case, and I thought that there was going to be books and a body of knowledge and experts that we could go call for the Long Now Foundation to figure this question out. It was just like it was amazingly blank. It was a really wide open space. I was like, all right, well, I guess now this is now our research project, and it seemed a reasonable place for us to do it. The there was there's been the resources are very scarce. There was a really interesting author collective called the Dark Angels Collective that wrote a book called Established, and it's stories of at least 12 of some of the oldest companies in the world. And there's certainly these lists that I've been concatenating of both regular organizations and companies that to kind of figure out which ones are there, but it's very interesting when you have to then contact them, even the modern management of a lot of these organizations and companies, they don't have a lot of introspection around how that's worked. They're very focused on the now, which is relative. Also, I was starting this project at the beginning of the pandemic, so they were extremely focused on the now at that moment. But it's been interesting how not necessarily introspective they all are.
Yeah, that was one of the things I was wondering as you were speaking was, were most of these institutions or organizations even aware of their special age? And if they were, did they have any theories themselves about why they were long-lived?
Well, I think it varies a lot, and I don't want to generalize too broadly, especially after not talking to tons of them. But anecdotally from the beginning of this, certainly they all kind of really old organizations are often they kind of brag about how old they are, and that's part of their kind of story, but and their internal organizational mythos. But I find it interesting how, like, one of the questions I came back to people was like, how did you survive the last pandemic? This is only 100 years ago, which in all many of these companies are over 1,000 years old, or organizations, and they're like, oh, that's a really good question. I have no idea. And so they, even for something that they were in the middle of trying to figure out how to resurvive, they had not asked that question. And so it's interesting. One of the funders of this project is James Anderson of Bailey Gifford, and he had already looked at, for instance, the way he found that out was looking at the public reports, the kind of annual reports of the company around that time. And it's just, he said it was wild when people were, those reports, as the pandemic was unfolding, they don't even mention it in these reports until it's like really a bad problem. And it's kind of very similar to the beginnings of this one. So it was interesting that it was very similar problems that were being repeated very, very in real time.
And again, to your first approximation on this very initial look at it, did you find that there were other advantages to this kind of long-livedness besides survival? I mean, other than the fact that they were surviving, was there anything else about them? Were they surviving at a better profit rate, or was it their metabolism different, or was there anything else about them that you could kind of detect that might be a possible theory?
Well, there seems to very much be an internal culture thing where the kind of employees are prepared mentally for this, and this management is prepared mentally for this. Where I think we saw this, for instance, play out in the opposite way at the beginning of the last big .com crash, where the employees were in no way, and the management was in no way prepared to shrink their company by even 20%, much less 60%. You saw, and they weren't ready to reinvent themselves. So we saw the music industry, and during the time of music becoming a digital commodity and a subscription service, that but you could talk to people within the music companies themselves, and every single one of them knew that their model was not going to survive what it was. But they could not they didn't culturally have the internal story to fix that. They sold music on plastic circles. That's what they did. And it took Apple and eventually other things like Napster forces to basically just take that away from them. So it's very important, it seems, to have developed a company or organizational culture that you prepare people. And it was Jeff Bezos who told me about talking about Amazon, who said, as the stock price was doubling, I told everyone that they weren't twice as smart as they were last quarter, and when the stock price goes down, you're not twice as dumb as the last quarter. We're just we have to keep making the company that has a real business model, and we just keep doing the thing. And so I think that engendering that is seems to be one of the most important things.
Yeah. So I want to bring in another questioner. I'm going to introduce Nick Bryce. Brycewitz, who is the Director of Development for Long Now. And Nick, you have some questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kevin and Xander. This was a fantastic talk. I've been looking forward to this for a while because it's such relevant research to so many different institutions. You had already mentioned that James Anderson with Bailey Gifford had, proudly supported the work that you're working on, as has the Ethereum Foundation. And I just think there's a broad application for the kinds of ideas you're running into. I'm curious about this idea of continuity as memory. And then memory kind of is something that's permanent. But I'm wondering if you've run into situations where the continuity of an organization or the continuity of a practice has been served by a kind of selective forgetting. If there are instances you've run into where people have decided what to leave behind because circumstances have changed or because their goals have changed. Have you run into anybody who's deciding, how do we decide what to remember and what to forget?
Well, I think it is really interesting. That question of like how, but I think it's maybe different than you phrase the question, at least from what I've seen, is that you don't want the people that are running your organization so hung up on the way things have been done in the past that they can't welcome in another generation usefully, that they can't listen to the fact that there are new tools, there are new markets, there are new situations in the world that is possible for a company to retry an idea they might have tried 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, in a new environment with new tools. And so, if they can't do that, I think that's almost as problematic as not having those stories to tell themselves. So, finding the way to be able to have at least, it seems, about 3 generations within an organization that's talking to itself and each other in a productive way that knows how to discern that. You don't want a generation basically saying, oh, even a current generation, if they have seen how that organization or even other organizations maybe have failed at something over and over and over again, they might not try the new thing. And so how do you temper that information in a way that says, all right, well, maybe we're different now, and it's worth trying. So I think that seems to be an interesting question of how best any organization can listen to its youngest members to find some of the kind of new energy of the world, the new things that might be happening in the world, the middle generation to interpret that, and the oldest generation to be giving some of that wisdom, and put those things together in a way that doesn't hamper the organization but also helps it answer those questions going forward.
That's a great idea. The multi-generationality of a continuous organization is probably one of the cooler aspects of getting people to kind of pass the baton back and forth across time. We were talking earlier about continuity as memory, but I'm also really interested in this idea of continuity in an aspirational sense. So there are certain things that take a week for us to do, and there are certain things that might take a century for people to do, or 2 centuries. And if you want to do something on a time scale that exceeds the human lifespan, you're going to need something like a long-lived institution to coordinate people across generations. But as we all kind of know, institutions can end up in a spot where they're in the business of just staying in business. So if you were setting out for something that was going to take 250 years, have you run into organizations that have baked into their culture or baked into their governance structure a way to adhere to the original idea of this is going to take 250 years, and there's a wind-up procedure? I'm thinking about the examples, things like these breweries, brasseries, hotels, hot springs. They kind of exist indefinitely, but then I think of things like cathedrals, and there has to be some kind of a limit to that organization. If you run into a whole suite of organizations that have kind of a finite ending point?
That's an interesting question. I think there's certainly some types of projects that people assume to only take a certain amount of time, but companies and organizations, they kind of think that they are going to be around, at least nobody wants to design a job that they're going to be out of. And so in some way, many organizations and companies, more than anything, are actually just they're perpetuation machines. Because everybody in the org is very interested in them perpetuating. I think certainly we've seen, there was very famously Benjamin Franklin created the Benjamin Franklin Trust that was supposed to invest. It was actually a reasonably small amount of money at the time and pay itself out, I think, over 200 years totally, or half at 100 years and half at 200 years, to both the cities of Philadelphia and Boston. And then also famously, it was that organization that managed that then has now perpetuated the Benjamin Franklin Trust and has ignored those original words. But certainly we've seen certain philanthropies that were designed to be paid out and cancel themselves out. And I think when that's done within the living space of the person who started it, they seem to actually do that. When it's left to go to another generation, again, those organizations just become these self-perpetuation machines that usually break that trust of the original donor. So it's I think that's of the examples that I know that have really been designed to cancel out. And go extinct on purpose. That's one of the only ones I know of.
And that's great. And so one of the ways that those kinds of purposes are passed forward in time is through different generations talking to each other and having a conversation about what to remember and what to forget. But we also have this ability to use texts and to use records across long periods of time to try and understand what people from past instances of an institution were thinking or wanted, or what their intentions might have been like. And I understand that you actually have had a chance to check out a number of different archives, because of course Long now is involved in some very special archiving projects. But then specifically, I'm thinking of a long-lived organization like the Catholic Church. Have you been able to talk to them at all about how they maintain a continuous thread going all the way back through their history?
Well, I was very lucky enough to visit the Vatican archives at one point, and the interesting. So I don't have a broad story from all levels of the Vatican, but at least from the Vatican archives, I thought it was really interesting. I mean, the Catholic Church is famously one of the oldest currently extant organizations on the planet at about 2,000 years almost. And the thing that and the Vatican archives themselves are amazing in their own right. But when I was getting the tour, I walked by this one room that had all these really thin drawers in it, and there was all these guys in like these little white suits picking things out of the drawers. And it was the Vatican was in the process of closing down for Easter Mass, which is a rare moment that the main basilica is closed. And so all these guys were picking out tiles for maintaining the mosaics of St. Peter's Basilica. And it turns out that over 500 years ago, when they commissioned the mosaics, they also commissioned the artists to do overruns. And famously, the artists in the records of that complained that they had to do overruns of all these colored tiles. And they're like, why do we'll just do it whenever you want it. And they're like, no, we want them on hand. And so for over 500 years, they've been able to grab these tiles and repair. And sure enough, as we were walking out of St. Peter's Basilica, they had erected all these scaffolds and were replacing all of these tiles in the mosaic. So not necessarily textual records, but these kind of physical records that this organization had thought hundreds of years in advance to basically to solve what would be an totally unsolvable problem, or at least a very difficult to solve problem, that it was very easy for them to, in a way, ask for that at the beginning, as long as they had the continuity of the organization to, keep them in the drawer, label the drawer properly, and remember it, 500 years in advance. So I think it was a great example of that.
So thanks, Nick. Those some great questions, and we want to move now to take some questions from the audience. Stuart Brand is off to the side, sorting those questions on YouTube or Facebook or it is in the video here if you have questions. One of the first ones he has pertains to what Nick was just saying. It's from Sci-Fi Action on YouTube. And the question would be, in these long-term institutions, are there any that can maintain innovation while they're trying to not just be a perpetual survival machine, but are you aware of any that continue to innovate at the same time?
I think certainly, I mentioned one of the examples I mentioned was universities. I think universities, clearly have at least whole parts of them that are always innovating. I think their basic model and their basic need that they're serving is education. But they, the great research universities of the world are totally innovating a lot. I think that in the cases of probably financial institutions is another place where, the oldest financial institutions have to stay at the forefront of financial products. And I think maybe some of the cases where some of the oldest ones where they might have probably survived some of these big financial shocks by at least tempering, all right, we're going to get into structured, leveraged lending around real estate, and then maybe had suffered a very bad problem in 2008, but had enough of their business tempered to not have gone out of business because of that. And so I think there's always a place where you should be. I think any organization should be innovating. I think when you're talking about the world's oldest hotels in Japan or Europe, they probably don't have a ton to innovate. They're, in a way, actually, by serving people the same way for generations is really what they're doing. I mean, I'm sure they've built a website at this point for a large consent, but that's there's something about advertising themselves maybe, but they in a way they're advertising that they have not changed for a long time.
Right.
So I think there's definitely a spectrum of that.
Their business is serving that which doesn't change, and so that's part of the reason why they haven't changed. So Stuart himself had a good question, which was, in this research, was there anything that surprised you that maybe you were not expecting when you set out?
Well, I mentioned it towards the end, which is this keeper of the fabric role. I think what was so surprising was how informal that role is in so many institutions. And I brought up the ones where it is formalized, like in Japan, temple building or cathedrals. But I think it's so funny where you're talking to the CEO or the lead of an organization now, and they're like, well, it's actually this guy doesn't even work for us, but he comes in and tells stories, periodically at at company-wide things he worked for us a long time ago, and so and they all regard this person with very highly as an important person for their organization, but that's not even within their organization, and it's not formalized. And so I think it's a very interesting lesson for any organization. Like, how do you formalize this, at least in a way where maybe you just give them an honorific that they kind of feel the importance of that storytelling part. And really the oldest thing we have for conveying knowledge is storytelling, and so it's the thing that we know can and will last for a very long time. But how we tell those stories within organizations, I think, is an interesting question.
Right, and it seems like most of what you've seen so far has been kind of oral transmission rather than anybody kind of writing it down, except for maybe those stones in Japan. So that oral tradition, but maybe what we're looking for is a different mechanisms besides an oral transmission.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting thing that I have found that is kind of surprising is that when you go and you look up the official history of some of these organizations, because they all kind of, on their website or somehow, they're bragging about how long they've been around. They have this very official history that really is very bad at telling the bad stories, which are really the stories that you need to understand to have an organization last. Like, I don't want to know how that organization survived the pandemic 100 years ago. I want to know how they survived the plague, 600 years ago. And these are the stories I want to know. And they basically they just gloss right over it. And they're like, well, this is, here's how we did all these things great. And clearly, those were problems for these organizations, and their lessons are valuable. They're either not documented, even their formal internal. Some companies have formal internal historians, but you ask them that question like, oh well, let's see if we can look this up, and they tend to not be well recorded times. I think mostly because they're scrambling during those times. It's the most difficult time to take time to make records. And when they're coming out of them, they're really thinking forward, not thinking backward. I think it's an interesting question in general of how we can be better at this. And I think I mentioned the WHO, the World Health Organization, that they have collected, and CDC have collected amazing information about the current pandemic that we're in. But how is that being preserved for the next one that could be 100 or more years out? I don't know.
So Chris Peel, another audience member, suggests a question of wondering whether there are things like tax incentives or other kinds of structures that might be implemented by the government to encourage generally these kinds of long-lived institutions. And maybe you have a 40-year investment that is paying off in 100 years, or other means in which governments. Have you seen at the government level any kind of encouragement anywhere in the world, maybe even Japan, where they incentivize a long-lived institution?
That's an interesting question. I mean, to be honest, I have not looked that much at tax code. Certainly it seems that in places like the United States that we tend to really deal with big problems more as an insurance model, that we kind of assume that we're going to wait for the problems and we're going to solve it with insurance. In Europe, a little bit different. Holland famously, really is building infrastructure for literally 10,000-year events around flooding, where in the United States we just kind of let the flood happen and then hope that insurance companies will solve it. So there's certainly that, and we certainly see some financial instruments like the 99-year agreements in Hong Kong or Panama Canal. And I think maybe the only thing I could imagine in the tax structure that I know of is countries that incentivize having children, and incentivize education, but the money that you might spend on education, and the United States does this to some extent, at least with the education side. In Europe, much more around actually having children, because as I mentioned, most of the industrialized world is now below replacement value, and causing very interesting kind of economic problems when there's no children adding into the economy. So I think that's the only place I know of offhand, but it's a great research topic.
Right, you could imagine a government saying, if your institution lives to be 100, taxes are half or something, just like a kind of like a Social Security level. So here's another interesting question from Brewster Kale, who started the Internet Archive backup, basically a long-term project if there was one. He was saying, well, just as in humans, we often have certain diseases associated with old age. Are there any particular kind of attacks or threats or challenges that longer lived institutions might exhibit or be susceptible to that younger ones don't?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think that often, at least the little bit that I know, maybe more anecdotally at this point than I will hopefully later in this project, but is this problem of how the youngest generation can talk to the oldest generation and vice versa. So how both wisdom can go down and new knowledge can go up, seem to be where things fail. If the old generation that's running a company, or the older generation that's running a company, can't listen to the new market forces, can't listen to the new things that are happening in the world, they're basically going to miss these opportunities. And then the same thing can go the other way. If the generation can't listen to the old generation, then they might not they might keep making repeat a mistake that could be fatal to an organization. So I think that's probably the first thing that I've found so far. But
It's like going
it's an
deaf.
interesting question. Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, but I think there is always a case for forgetting on some level. You don't if the only thing you know is how something has not worked, you may not ever try it again. And so I think that's a real problem that is worth thinking about how you temper that kind of information within an organization.
So one of the things I was wondering is if there was any kind of lateral communication between longer lived institutions, whether any of them were exchanging or realizing again that they're part of a community in any sense of where they were sharing what they've learned. David Grossoff was wondering if, in the way that the Dalai Lama was trying to pass on, transmit information in the diaspora, whether there was in other institutions some sense of, well, we've lasted this long. How have you done it? And so, is there any sense of them even communicating with other long-lived organizations?
Surprisingly, it seems very, very limited to my knowledge, and they often kind of very much live within a bubble. And I think they have this kind of feeling of like, all right, we've been around for 600 years. Like, who do we need to really talk to? We pretty much, outlast. I mean, one of the organizations I mentioned was the temple complex at Ise in Japan, and I think was talking with their historian, and apparently they were approached to become a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and they're over 1600 years old, if at minimum. And so their response was like, why do we care about this 50-year-old organization that might tell us that we're
Those
important?
bikers.
And like, once UNESCO is 1600 years, like, come back to us, and that maybe we'll listen. So I think it was interesting to hear that. There's one organization that I know of that's it's very informal, which is a French it was French founded, of family run businesses that have lasted over 200 years around the world. And several organizations or several, mostly companies, family run companies, are members of that. And I'm forgetting the name of it. It's a French name. But they do, so they apparently talk to each other and sometimes have meetings, or at least get together and pay attention to each other.
Right. So maybe this is a last question to wrap up with, but the Long Now Foundation itself is now 25 years old. We think of ourselves in our first quarter, a quarter being a quarter century. You've done this research. What have you come back to take back from that to change the way that you want to run the Long Now Foundation as its director? What is there a specific lesson that you thought, we really should do here? This is something that we should be doing.
Well, I mean, you actually mentioned it. I think the thing that has come out of this research, in a way, it was inspired by these temples that are rebuilt every 20 years in Japan. Is this, you need to, I think, formalize a refreshing cycle where the generation that after 25 years, it's roughly a human generation in a way, says, all right, what DNA do we want to bring with us, and how do we want that to instruct the next 25 or 20 or whatever it is, whatever your cycle is? How do we want that to instruct but not limit? And so we want it. We want that. That's what we're kind of doing right now at Long Now at 25 years. Is the founders came from a time, started in the mid 90s. It was a very optimistic technological time, and it's certainly become a less optimistic technological time now. But how do we take that DNA, make it inspiring to another generation, but not over limit that problem? Because you want new people to come in who are interested in solving new problems. What is the next 10,000 year clock project, the next Rosetta project, that is going to be really interesting as we finish some of these other projects? And that to me is the big challenge, is not becoming too limiting in the information we hand off, but giving people enough framework that they feel empowered to do new and amazing things.
You often talk about trusting the future in a certain sense, and that seems like part of what you want to do with a long-lived institution is in some ways transmit that trust forward and that faith in the next generation.
Indeed, I mean, trusting the future, I think that's a key kind of both preserving optionality and trusting the future is something that has really emerged over the whole time that we've been at Long Now. Is that if you're making any decisions that limit the next generations more than open possibility for them, you're probably not helping that generation. Like they are going to have more information about their present than you could ever predict about, from as a futurist. So how can you make choices that don't take away their optionality seems to be a really important principle.
And I know that you're really waiting for the COVID period to pass so you can get out and begin to visit. Do you have a specific approach or plan to answer some of these questions? And can maybe the people in the audience in some ways help? Is there some way that anyone who is interested in this could participate in this?
Certainly, I mean, I'm always open to look for new interesting examples for this and connections. It seems it's in many cases it's very difficult to kind of get to the right person in some of these organizations that will talk to you about this. And so I've been hiring researchers in different countries to start doing the research within those countries, and then hopefully starting to make some of those connections that I can go and interview them, because I think I'm going to find very interesting things when I visit physically, when I talk to these people physically, and I think I'm going to get, again, a lot better information than I get from official histories that you might get, reading a website or something like that. I've already been getting some good ideas, to read things like, in some cases, the company reports from that time that were officially the reports from a time of great shock or change, and kind of see how that company or organization talked about it. But there seems to be very spotty records around those times. So I'm hoping if I go there, I might be able to open a shoebox that's been at the bottom of someone's desk for a long time and pull out some letters that might shed a little bit more light into it.
Well, Xander, I wish you, and we all wish you, the best of success in your investigation and looking at this systematically. I think it would be a great service to the Long Now and our interest in fostering long-term thinking. So thank you for this fantastic talk. I learned so much, which I had no idea about. We really appreciate your being here.
Thank you so much. Well, it was great to be on the other side of the chair for one of these talks, and thank you for hosting. And looking forward to some of the future talks at Long Now. It was fun to present here.
And I thank members and other audience who are joining us for this talk of the Thinking Long-Term. And we hope that you can join us in another seminar for long-term thinking. Thank you.